We're going to go ahead and start now. I wanted to go ahead and welcome everyone. My name is, thank you for coming to Redefining Productivity at the 2024 CU Builder Disability Symposium. My name is Robyn Labrador Ronen. I have the pleasure of introducing this panel who will introduce themselves after for today's session. I am a white woman with brown hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a green top that you can see in the screen and white earbuds. The University of Colorado Boulder is hosting this disability symposium to acknowledge that more work must be done to improve inclusion of persons with disabilities on the Boulder campus. Efforts to improve inclusion must focus on students, staff, and faculty. The 2021 CU Boulder Campus Climate Survey Report, which is released in April of 2022, found that 44% of undergraduate students and 47% of graduate students reported experiencing incivility in the prior 12 months. For students with disabilities, these numbers climbed to 54% and 62% respectively. The symposium is a springboard to continue campus-wide conversations on how each of us can improve inclusion on campus and improve support for all persons with disabilities. The symposium organizers would also like to take a moment to issue a land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on. I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat.
Wasn't there some way? Like,
CU Boulder acknowledges that it is.
You switched it to like
I
on
am
display.
sorry, someone is.
All you have to do, so you find the book, and then it's this.
Robyn, this is Patricia. If you can make me co-host, I can mute everyone that's unmuted.
Thank you so much.
So
Let me go
right now
ahead
it says
and
it's
make you co-host.
Yeah. Do I have to go to a different page or something? Oh, I just double clicked it.
Yep.
Maybe I'll just do that one. I just want to do it for tomorrow when I show.
Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
See
CU
whichever one
Boulder.
makes the most sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. CU Boulder acknowledges that this is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you so much for those two hiccups. I know there was 2 different advertised times, so I appreciate that you have stuck with us. And Patricia, thank you so much for going ahead and helping with that auditory issue. And with that, I'm going to leave it over to our panel today.
Thanks so much, Robyn. So like Robyn said, we're here for our presentation on redefining productivity. I am Callan McNamara, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an advisor in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'll leave it over to my other panelists to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. Beautiful. Love the thumbs up in Zoom world. My name's Megan Rogers. I'm a senior first-year advisor in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'll pass it off to Tabs.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tabitha Lanham. I go by Tabs, she, her pronouns. For a visual description, a white woman, long brown hair, wearing a black shirt against the green background. I'll go ahead and send it over to Charles.
Hi, everybody. Charles Egan. I am a senior academic advisor for psychology and neuroscience in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm a white guy with a beard and a CU staff baseball cap with a black button t-shirt with patterns and some blurry rainbow yarn behind me. And I'll pass it over to Megan.
Me, I think. Can we go to the next slide? Awesome. So here is a pre-assessment. If you want to take that before we start, I'll just leave it up there for a second. Awesome. I think that's good. If you want to also put that in the chat, I don't know, Robyn, but I think we can keep her trucking. All right, great. So just outlining what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off by framing disability and chronic illness. Then talk about our theoretical frameworks for today. Then transitioning from that theory to practice, do a little reflection activity. It's going to be really fun. And then finish up by talking about how you can lead that change in your teams. Next slide. So the learning outcomes for today is we're going to examine how internalized ableism shows up in our workplaces and in our relationship dynamics in those workplaces, provide strategies for how supervisors and staff can challenge ableist and neurotypical expectations around time, productivity, and social interactions in the workplace. And finally, encourage leadership and their teams to prioritize accessibility by considering individuals' strengths, abilities, and limitations in the delegation of tasks and goal setting. And now I'll turn it over to Megan for our first section.
Thanks, Callan. So we're going to start to two prominent models of disability. How do we contextualize and think about disability? How do we understand our relationship, right, with disability? A traditional model, like the medical model that we have listed on this first slide, definitely informs our functions in societies and institutions like the workplace for sure. Disability is viewed as a disease or an impairment located within the individual to cure, to fix, right, with the goal to return to a functioning degree of normalcy that we've all kind of socially constructed. Medical professionals and others are given a strong degree of decision-making power over disabled people's treatments that can sometimes then put the disabled person into what Parsons coined a sick role. This is where a lot of our societal expectations and assumptions, childcare, if those of us have children, are responsible for children, working, taking care of the home, right, and those other obligations are excused. Can we move on to the next slide just to save some time here? Appreciate it, Charles. And now we want to move into the second model, which was created in direct opposition of that medical model from communal and shared experiences of disabled people and activists, right? It identifies the systems of oppression and marginalization that are embedded within our society and in our environments all around us, right? That actually create the disability and produce the barriers. Economic examples live within our existing policies. For example, Social Security income eligibility, which is a common resource that disabled folks use for income and basic necessities. Disabled individuals receiving Social Security income are not allowed to have more than $2,000 worth of resources like cash, bank accounts, land, as some examples we pulled from the Social Security website, without it negatively impacting their eligibility to receive that income. The income cap for two people that are receiving SSI income only jumps up about $1,000 to $3,000 there. And there's an obvious concern with that limit, knowing the growing cost of basic necessities, let alone healthcare. In our social environment, we write in our communications, right, our tone, our body language, right, infantilization, the assumptions, the stereotypes, right, whether implicit or not, right, are examples of how that shows up in our social world. And we'll just keep moving to our second slide here. And we're going to shift more into chronic illness and disability now that we kind of have those bigger picture models in mind. Chronic illness is a progressive, episodic, or constant disease that does require ongoing medical care. Medical care, right, can vary with the management of the conditions, but not necessarily with this goal of fixing, right, or curing. A 2022 CDC report found that more than 1 in 4 adults in the US, which equates to about 70 million people, self-reported their own disability there. Some examples of maybe more well understood, well-funded, right? Chronic illnesses, diabetes, and heart disease are some of the couple ones. But there are a lot of less funded and honestly less understood, right, chronic illnesses, particularly ones that may be invisible, right? like POTS, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, ME, chronically known as chronic fatigue syndrome, endometriosis, right? And so it's really important that we keep in mind then the timeline, right, it takes for someone to reach an accurate diagnosis and treatment if possible. Do they know something is wrong? Are they believed? Do they have access to appropriate care and specialists where they live? Minimal funding, and again, research progress, medical bias, medical racism, misdiagnosis, and other factors like these are definitely can contribute to that timeline there. And just on the topic, as we keep us moving forward, of kind of emerging or unknown kind of chronic illness is long COVID. On this next slide here, excuse me, the name and anecdotal kind of evidence
Oh, good.
stemmed from, I believe so.
I need
Okay,
your help
really quick.
with more than just a bed. I didn't realize my office
Are
chair
you
is
able to
even.
read that in the chat? Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. So emerging, right, conversation, discovery, research on long COVID. It originally stemmed from folks back in 2020, 2021 who were experiencing long COVID, but there wasn't a diagnostic tool. There wasn't a name for it, right? So it's really important to emphasize that advocacy from patients on the ground there. And sorry, I'm just going back to my notes here. And while there isn't an exact number, there is a growing mountain of evidence that suggests roughly 7% of adults in the US having long COVID, right there. There was a very recent diagnosis made in 2024 from New England School of Medicine that we want to use for this conversation today that defines long COVID as an infection-associated chronic condition that occurs after symptomatic or asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 or COVID infection that is present for at least 3 months as a continuous, relapsing, and remitting or progressive disease that affects one or more organ systems. And while the causes and treatments, right, for this disease are ongoing, a comprehensive 2024 Nature Medicine medical journals really stated that preventing the SARS-CoV infection or reinfection is the best way to prevent long COVID. Prevention strategies, masking, vaccinations, air ventilation and filtration, staying home or isolated if you are sick. And then kind of moving us forward to how do we look to the future with more funding and more understanding that's needed, right? That's where we really want to plug the Long COVID Research Moon Act of 2024 that's proposing over $10 billion of funding through the National Institute of Health there to create an entire new research program dedicated to the understanding and treatment and care of long COVID and maybe other less studied and understood diseases like POTS, like CFS. Okay. And then we're going to move on to our next slide here and really connecting and circling in the world of law here. ADA is another really critical and important piece of federal legislation that provides legal protections from discrimination on the basis of disability in everyday life for that everyday access, right? So workplaces are required to provide reasonable accommodations for people that have chronic illness or otherwise disability that they can access, although there isn't a guarantee or a mandate that their requested accommodations will be or are approved, which leaves an important gray area for interpretation in our kind of continued discussion today. A lot of challenges, right, with accessing meaningful workplace accommodations that we wanted to note, such as, again, this timeline to reaching diagnosis. Hypothyroidism is a really kind of growingly, increasingly common chronic illness that can take several years for people to get diagnosed. Right, it can be dismissed, mirroring other symptoms or other kind of appropriate developmental aging factors. And again, obtaining an accurate diagnosis, right? And then, of course, just naming the stigma, right? To self-disclose that information is a really, really personal choice, right? That everyone has to navigate and make meaning for in their own ways. But we just wanted to highlight some of these important sort of, I guess, areas for concern as we continue to talk about theoretical frameworks that Charles is going to continue on with.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So yes, now that we've got some of the big issues of today out there, I'm going to go into some of our theoretical framework, like Megan said. First framework that I wanted to introduce is crib theory. So crib theory emerged in the early 21st century, give or take, and it has a lot of pretty prominent scholars like Robert McClure, Alison Kafer, J. Timothy Domage, and a ton more. And what it does is it's affirming those lived experiences of disability, and it really acknowledges the power in the knowledge that comes from those lived experiences. Where it came from was the merging of queer theory and critical disability studies, but more than anything else, you can't really talk about crip theory without talking about intersectionality. Crip theory works very hard to acknowledge that people are multifaceted and bring a lot of different identities and lived experiences to the table, which I think is what can make it such a rich field to explore. One of the core sort of concepts in crip theory that we're going to be talking about today is crip time. So Kafer defines this as a challenge to normative and normalizing expectations of pace and scheduling. So rather than bending disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crip time blends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. So truly what it's doing is prioritizing the person and who they are over the deadline. So to that end, we would encourage you over the course of this presentation to just sort of examine the deadlines that your team currently has set and where they come from. Tabs will get into that a little bit more too later. Okay, another key framework we're going to be talking about is the interactionist model. I don't know if you can really read it there, but I have tiny little copies of the social model and medical model of disability. If you looked at those a little bit more closely, you'd see that they're unidirectional. The problem is either the world being inaccessible or the person needing accommodations. It's quite black and white. The interactionist model acknowledges that it's a lot more complex and that it can go both ways. It sort of combines the social and medical model and turns that into a spectrum. And it sort of shows that it's a little bit more fluid. And right here is this interactionist model. If you can't tell, that's what this bad boy is. So what it does is it acknowledges the fact that environments can range from being enabling to disabling. People can make more and less effective choices, and disabilities can vary from minimal to significant. But these three elements, environment, disability, person, they all influence each other as well. Now, the workplace is a critical area to consider when we're thinking about this model, because we spend a lot of time in the workplace. And that not only does that include just like physical space, but it includes our colleagues and leadership. Again, not just in terms of sharing physical space, but socially and psychologically. Because we spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in some cases, hanging out with these people, we're spending clearly quite a bit of time, and we do have professional relationships with them. That is where I would like to talk a little bit about relationship theory, quite briefly. So why would we want to consider relationship theory? Working on a team means that you have relationships with the people that you're working with. You have positive interactions, negative interactions. You might be close, you might not be super close. There could be power dynamics present if we're thinking about employee to supervisor level there. Those are all things that impact how we interact with one another. Having a basic understanding of relationship theory can help us understand how to create a safe and inclusive workplace. It also helps us understand how and why our interactions within our relationships end with either positive or negative results. So on the left here, I've got some aspects of relationship theory that help create healthy workplace cultures. One that is leaned into a lot is positive psychology. Positive psychology is a branch of psych that studies how to promote well-being and optimal functioning within like people, groups, and institutions. If you go into organizational psych, you might see a lot of this popping up. Seligman's PERMA theory of well-being, which is the second part of here, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. It's an attempt to define the factors that allow us to flourish in the workplace. So those 5 aspects are the building blocks for helping people feel fulfilled and to flourish and be their best selves. Finding opportunities for all members of the team to experience these factors is key, regardless, of course, of ability. So here's just a couple examples of healthy workplace cultures. If we were to look on the other side of that, we've got some unhealthy workplace cultures aspects here. There is, of course, bank theory, which I think many of us might have heard of before. That's where social interactions are viewed as transactions. I'll do X for you, but I'm expecting you to do Y later. Bank theory is particularly kind of insidious because it's in American culture, at least, a lot of this is unspoken and just sort of assumed. So you're helping someone out, you're helping someone out, you're helping someone out. So like you're giving them a token, you're giving them a token, you're giving them a token, you're hoping eventually they'll give you the tokens back. So that can create, it is tied to social capital, sense of self, and sense of belonging. And of course, things like burnout. The other one that I want to go into is social comparison theory, which I'll jump into on the next slide. But bringing it back around, the main point of this is that relationships can cause joy, like make you feel like you belong in a workplace, or they can be a source of social pain. Which, let's examine that a little bit. So, the old saying goes, comparison is the thief of joy. These are some of the negative impacts, negative factors that can influence a workplace. Comparing your work relationships with the work relationships between others, like you having a good relationship with colleague A, but bad with colleague B, but somehow colleague A and colleague B get along really well. You're not getting why that's the case. That can be the cause of some sort of negative emotions. The other thing is the dangers of sort of different expectations. Not everyone is going to do the same task exactly the same way or in exactly the same time frame. Some people need accommodation. Some people are either just naturally really good or not so good at certain tasks. Different expectations can both create a more accessible work environment and also breed resentment over being perceived negatively, as in not getting fair treatment, or someone is getting specialized treatment that you don't understand why you don't have access to that. Negative perception is a pretty significant part of social pain. According to a study by Dunbar and Dunbar, it literally activates the same part of the brain that reacts when we experience physical pain. So on a biological level, it makes sense that when we don't feel as if we're being treated well or fairly, our performance at work sinks and our inner work relationships are negatively impacted. When we experience these sort of negative perceptions, it can be that much harder for us to connect in a positive way with our colleagues and our supervisor. And again, we're spending a third of our lives with these people in many circumstances, and we're human. Connection is key and has a massive impact on how we move through and flourish in the workplace. So, sorry, I flew through that because I want to make sure we have enough time. I'm going to pass it off. Now that I've gone through the theory element, Tabs is going to help walk us through how to connect all of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles. So yeah, as mentioned, we are going to shift from theory to practice. And as you've noticed, the theme of today is thinking about how as individuals, we can inform our practices and our mindsets to increase intentional accessibility for everyone that we interact with, knowing that there are limitations and pitfalls of some of the systematic accommodation operations that are in place. So we're going to start with just a really quick summary recap of the three theories that just came up. Sorry, I got a notice that my internet was unstable, but I think we're okay. Okay. Hopefully I don't freeze. I am on campus, so we should be okay. Anyway, the first one we talked about was crip time. So I think the main takeaway there that we can remember and keep this in our minds is the idea of bending the clock to meet disabled and neurodiverse minds and bodies rather than the other way around. We talked about interactionist theory. So the idea that environments can be enabling or disabling, so they can exacerbate or accommodate disabilities and neurodivergence. And people are a really big part of environment. So it's not just physical space, and it's not just the individual's outward experience. We all have an impact there. And then finally, we talked about some relationship theories. And the two that we're going to go a little bit deeper into are bank theory, which is the idea that social interactions should be treated like transactions. And there's that social capital tied up in that. And then the social comparison theory. And so that is that natural thinking pattern that we all have that involves your biases and how you understand other relationships and compare them to the ones that you have. So first, we'll talk about crip time. So here are some of the outcomes that can happen when we integrate crip time into our mindset and our practice. One of the big things that you can see on here is that it reminds us there's no like one size fits all approach when it comes to accessibility. And in fact, we shouldn't be looking for that, even if it did exist. We should be embracing the individual ways that people get things done and that people thrive, and interrogating, are the expectations and the systems that we are upholding aligning with that? And if not, what is the reason there? Is it because they can't, just because of the context of where we're at? Or is it because it's just never been evaluated, right? So that's one thing that Crip Time can help us keep in mind. The other thing Crip Time can help us just acknowledge and recognize in each other is our humanness. So well-being, health, just your mindset, that's all going to ebb and flow over time, you know, from month to month, even day to day, and even sometimes within, you know, the same day, right? That's just the human condition. And keeping Crip Time in our minds and integrated into the way that we show up at work can really help us remember that we all have that humanness, and there's always going to be a little bit of that like gray area to work with, and how can we adjust our expectations and our supports to meet people where they are. So now we'll look at some general examples. These are really broad. They might seem a little silly or like a little undefined, and that's purposeful, right? We didn't want to like get too specific and feel like somebody was getting called out. But these are some general times when having an understanding of Crip Time and embracing that can make a difference in terms of accessibility. I do see a question about Crip Time. That's a really great question. Thank you for asking. I meant to say this at the beginning. Crip actually is derived from cripple, right? So it's one of those terms that has been reclaimed and is used in a positive light in this context. So when we say Crip Time, that's where that comes from. And as Charles mentioned, it comes out of the work and experiences and scholarship of disabled and neurodivergent scholars. Hopefully that helped.
It did. Now I can stop thinking about Snoop Dogg and like really connect. I needed that break in my mind.
Yeah.
I missed that part. So thank you.
You're welcome. Not a problem. Yeah, this is different than the Crip walk. Definitely different. But anyway, where was I? Yes, so these are some examples of places where integrating that mindset of bending the clock can really be helpful. I think a knee-jerk reaction that can happen when we talk about Crip Time in the workplace is the idea of, well, how can we embody that if we have deadlines and schedules and expectations that need to be met? And that's very valid, right? Like that's a really valid concern, especially given the context. But the crux of Crip Time is to think about, not throw those things out the window, like we can't just completely disregard them, but it is thinking about more so how can we include accessibility and supports that help people thrive where they're at in a way that we can maybe still meet those deadlines and expectations. And again, the other side of that is evaluating those deadlines and expectations, which we'll talk more about later. So overall, the question is, how do we meet them where they are instead of how do we get them to where we want them to be to fit our neurotypical, potentially ableist expectations and requirements? Hey. So now we'll talk about the interactionist model. The interactionist model, these are some of the outcomes that can happen when we center that model in our approach and in our mindset. One of the big ones I want to point out is that second bullet point. The point of this, of remembering that you as an individual are a part of the environment that can be enabling or disabling, is remembering that we are collective, and the burden and responsibility of supporting folks that need accommodations for whatever reason should be on the collective and the systems, and not just on the individual that experiences the disability or the neurodivergence or whatever it is. So reminding us to shift that labor, and that we do have some role there, right? It reminds us that there are real gaps and limitations of the ADA accommodations and of neurotypical expectations that are just kind of the default, and reminds us that we can help fill that gap. So as teammates, you know, how can I show up for others? As a team leader, how can I leverage the power I have? So we'll go on to, before we go on to the next one, sorry, Charles. I do want to point out this: avoid creating forced intimacy or forced reliance on others, especially for physical inaccessibility. That's a really big one. So if your space that you're inviting folks into is not accessible and would require other people to like lean on others without their knowledge or consent beforehand to participate or engage in where you're at, your space is not accessible, and that needs to be reevaluated. You know, again, within limitations, sometimes there's nothing that we can do about like physical things, but that's when it's empowering them to make those informed decisions. Like on the first bullet point is saying, hey, we recognize this limitation of this space. If you wanted to engage in this space, it would require X, Y, Z. Now you're informed, you can choose whether or not you want to show up, and kind of giving people that option and that information. So going on to the examples, again, these are going to be really broad examples that can fit a lot of different things. But these are some places where, as teammates, if you are working with someone who is experiencing any of these situations, you can show up with grace and understanding. And again, think about ways that maybe you can help with the inaccessibility that maybe you're seeing. And again, as team leads, thinking about ways to leverage your power to address some of these things. So I think just in the interest of time, I will probably skip over going into that, but we're going to go into relationship theory. So relationship theory is that the idea that we all have natural brain patterns, or I guess the reason that we bring it up is because we all have natural brain patterns, and that can be useful in some contexts, but it's not always going to be the best gauge of information, because you're not always going to have all of the information about everything. So keeping relationship theory in our minds and integrating it into the way that we show up at work can help us avoid thinking about social capital as transactional, and avoid seeing people who maybe have more or less perceived social capital as having an impact on their performance. And it also, again, goes back to that idea of embracing equity, meaning give the people what they need on an individual basis as much as possible, over that one size fits all approach. Keeping these theories in mind can really help us think about fairness versus equity and where those fit into our workplace. So if we go over to the examples, we're going to go into this a little bit. When I think about relationship theory, the thing that comes to my mind is that quote about looking over into your neighbor's bowl. So you never look into your neighbor's bowl to see if you have what they have. You only look to make sure that they have enough. So that's kind of the idea here is you're going to have perceptions, and you are likely, most of the time, are not going to have the full scope of what's happening with other people. And so this is a place where an individual mindset of giving each other grace and understanding and accepting that if someone has an accommodation or someone is being held to a different standard per se, that there's probably a reason for that. And that does not mean that your work or your ability to show up is any less, right? It's not a comparison. It is thinking about supporting your teammates in the way that you would want to be supported. So I want to point out the last bullet point, because I think that one can be kind of common, right? So Sandy notices her teammate has been taking a lot of sick time, but does not know why. But she does have a negative view of this teammate because they're out so often. I think this example can be pretty common, right? It can. There's a certain feeling when you feel like you're showing up constantly and you have a perception that someone else isn't doing that, right? But I think when that happens, we need to take a step back and remember we have this internal bias and this internal natural inclination to want to know and want to be able to judge those things. But we should take a step back out of that judging zone and remember we're never going to know the full scope of someone else's situation. And so we as teammates and as leaders should be understanding of that and allowing people to have the grace that they need and the support that they need without judgment. I think that's all I've got for this one here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Tabs. Before we jump into strategies and suggestions, we did want to do a brief reflection opportunity. If someone wouldn't mind putting the code and the website in the chat, we just have a really quick Menti that we'd like to go through. I'm going to pull it up on my end as well. Okay. So on that Menti, it's going to ask you these 3 prompts. Take some time. Let's say, how are we doing on time? Do we have like 5 minutes for this? 3 minutes?
I think you comfortably have 5 minutes based upon the number of slides I'm seeing
Sweet.
left.
Okay. Awesome. So let's take 5 minutes to go through these prompts. I'm going to also try and get the Menti up on my screen here, but sorry, let me get that set up.
I have it pulled up if it's quicker for me to just take the share over.
Yeah, sure. That would be great. Here, I'll do that.
Sweet. Awesome. Okay, so this is the first question. Can you think of a time when crip time values had or would have had a positive impact on you or others? And we'll give you about a minute or two to throw your answers and examples in there. I'll try to keep scrolling so that we can keep reading them. These are all really great. There are some very specific ones. That's really helpful to see. We deliver in 2-week cycles. That may be an area that could benefit from crib time values. Yeah. Thinking about why is it that way? What's the function of that? And where's flexibility maybe? If I'm scrolling too fast, let me know if anybody wants to read one that I went past. I'm trying to kind of keep it even as much as possible. Positive responsiveness. Yeah, see, that speaks to the mindset and the way that we show up on how that can have a really big impact on just how we feel. Being able to do certain aspects of work off hours. Awesome. Can think of so many times for myself. In the winter when folks are experiencing seasonal, always. Yep. That's a good one. That's so true. Flexibility to step away to decompress. Oh, you guys, these are really great reflections. And I hope that as you're like thinking about this, you're thinking about ways that you can show for yourself and for other people. Cool. Okay, so we could go on for a long time, and I wish we had the time to really delve into all of this with you guys, with you all, excuse me. But we're going to go on to the next question, if that's okay. We will share this along with the stuff at the end in case you want to reflect back. Okay, cool. So the next one says, what is an example of the interactionist model that you have experienced or observed? So remember, this is the environment, space, and people all can work together to be enabling or disabling. And those things can be in odds, for sure. And not policing the use of sick time. Yep, that's a really big one. Here at CU Boulder, you have up until 3 days before you actually have to give a legit reason. So remember that. Don't let your supervisor tell you otherwise. Silently supporting colleagues who we know are struggling. Yeah, okay, so I am assuming that means like trying not to put them like on blast or make it obvious in a way. That's kind of where I think that one's going. Giving people benefit of the doubt, 100%, it's a good thing to live by. Behaving differently at a company event than with close friends. Yeah, that's true. Excess vacation time, off to a bank for those who need it. Ideally, we wouldn't have to have a bank, but yep, that's also a great way to give back. Reaching out to a venue about stairs, restrooms, etc. Sharing those details with the group. Yeah, that's exactly going on that informed decision-making area. Working to make spaces accessible as a baseline, as opposed to being reactionary. Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think that's one where there are definitely some room to grow, right? We sometimes grant exam accommodation students who cannot afford to get the official done. Awesome. Love that. Meeting acceptance and understanding. These are all really great examples of the way that the interactionist model can look in real time. Understand mental and physical health are connected. They are so connected. They cannot be separated. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay. In the spirit of time, we are going to go on to the next one, and we are going to be kind of quick on this one. How have you seen relationship comparison theory and bank theory show up in your workplace? I'm sure we all have a story or two about this, but if you've got a quick one to throw up in here, that would be awesome. Able-minded people are rewarded and given preference while neurodiverse folks are harmed. Yes, that is very real. And that's that is part of the reason that we are here today, to talk about the ways that individuals have that impact. My supervisor absolutely compares workers to each other and derides others in individual meetings. This is not a good thing and hard to document. That's true. I hope they're here and I hope they heard us about that is not the way to do it. And I don't have anything else to say about that one. Sorry about that. I like started a sentence, but then didn't go on. Optional, read mandatory. Yep, socialization on a job that is based almost entirely around social interaction. Continuing to apologize for being different. Yes, that one is really tough and is something that we shouldn't have to do at all, ever. My other presenters, I know, I'm sorry, I'm kind of just like narrating this, but if you all have things to say, feel free. You are othered and shamed if you can't attend after hours events. Some people just don't want to, and some people can't. So true. Especially if you're not like a drinker and all of those things are like happy hours at a bar. That can be very isolating. And that could be feedback that we give to the team lead to say, hey, like, is there a way we can make this more inclusive? Maybe happen at a different time, or just not an expectation. I think as team leads, that's something we should definitely keep in mind, and we'll talk more about. I know a person in my department, his supervisor upset for taking earned sick time. Wow. Yeah. So there are a lot of ways that these theories can show up, and a lot of, and I'm seeing a theme in a lot of these is individual mindsets and perceptions and how they are, right? Like most of these are not like, oh, my ADA accommodations were not fulfilled. These are like, I was dealing with this human and this human made me not feel good. So thank you all for your feedback. We really appreciate it. Callan's gonna bring us home with some things that we can do, some actions we can take.
Yeah.
These were really great responses. I think it feeds really well into this next section. So keep all those in mind. So I'm just going to be digging a little bit more into what Tabs was talking about, just getting into more specific suggestions for supervisors and teams, and then just ending with a little conclusion. Next slide. All right, so some strategies specifically aiming at our supervisors or our team leads. So as Tabs has been hinting, supervisors, you have the power in these relationships. And that's a really big deal. You have the power to create policy, and you also have the power to make exceptions, to be flexible to a certain extent. So that's really something that we encourage you to interrogate, to think about. Tabs mentioned this a little bit earlier, but thinking about the policies that are in place in your unit, thinking about the deadlines, thinking about even your culture, as a lot of people were mentioning in the mentee, who think, again, our interactionist model, who is that benefiting, who is that inclusive of, and who is that not as inclusive of? I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly, but again, using your position of power to shut down ableist assumptions, whether that comes through your own thinking and thoughts, or whether that's existing on your team. For sake of time, let's just go to the next slide. Yeah. So expanding on this example here that Tabs brought up, your employee Coraline has a chronic illness that she does not wish to file officially as a disability. She still occasionally experiences flare-ups, and she hopes to work out a system for flexibility with her supervisor. So again, thinking back to what I mentioned on the previous slide, you as a supervisor, as a team lead, could create a supportive work environment for that employee. And how you might want to do that is getting curious. We always talk about powerful questioning in advising. So what sorts of powerful questions could you ask to this employee to get what they really need? And then again, as a supervisor, thinking about what deadlines, what policies, what meetings, what things can you be flexible on? What things can't you, like Tabs was saying. The biggest thing that I think people don't often think about or don't think ahead as much on is the next steps. So people are going to have those biases that come up. So even if you're super advocate supervisor, you're awesome, other people might not be that way. So you need to think about how you can advocate to the other colleagues on your team, your leadership, about your plan. So you and Coraline made a plan together. This is what it's going to be. This is how the work is going to continue to get done. And this is why it's good for the whole. This is why it's good for the unit. And finally, just continuing your own learning and development. Maybe you're more experienced with people with chronic illnesses, and maybe not. You're all here doing this work and continuing your learning, but how can you continue to do that? Next slide. I see a hand. Is it possible to hold that till the end? No?
I don't need to have it answered. That's fine. If
Okay.
we don't have time, that's fine.
Okay. Well, I think we'll have time at the end. So continuing with these strategies for teams, gathering thoughts. So when we talked a lot about social comparison. So when you're with your teammates, even leadership, that sort of social comparison is coming up. So thinking a lot about how you can shift that perspective. One example that I gave is individualistic versus collectivist thinking. So if I'm comparing myself to Tabs, just for example, oh, maybe Tabs doesn't have to come to our weekly staff meeting. I might say, oh, that's so unfair. But what else is Tabs bringing to our team? What else is she doing? Is she still getting the work done? That sort of thing. And how is she contributing to the ultimate goal of supporting our students? And then some other things here, practice identifying structural barriers. So when you're coming up, when that internalized bias is coming up for you, what are the real barriers that are in place? And I really want to touch on this last point while we're on this slide, because a lot of people brought up the socialization aspect during our last question in the mentee. And so we wanted to highlight that this is not just all about work. It's not just all about what work you're getting done, it's the social aspects as well. So thinking about, okay, is your team going out for happy hours? Is that what you guys do? Do you all eat lunch together? Do you send little teams messages to each other? And how is that inclusive of everyone? We talked about it as active and passive. So maybe a team's message is a little more passive. Going out to eat afterwards, that might be a little more active. And how are different methods inclusive of different people? Go through the next slide really quickly. So this is another example, kind of like what I was talking about, my example with tabs. Squidward feels it's unfair that another teammate has a different expectation for an 8 a.m. meeting time than he does for seemingly no reason. So these are just some questions you can kind of think of to practice that mindset shifting that we were talking about. Are they still getting the work done? What positive contributions are they bringing to the team? And then what sort of barriers might the normal expectations create? I'm going to just go to the next slide and wrap it up. So throughout this whole presentation, we've talked a lot about individual change that we can make, which is, again, super important. But I wanted to finish on a note about individual change. Although it's important, we still need systemic change. So these are just a few things that we wanted to mention regarding systemic change. So again, leading with universal design first. So when you're creating those policies, thinking of things that are inclusive to everyone. Training on disability awareness. So thinking about that first, continuing that training within your units. We've already mentioned this a lot, but providing flexibility. Flexibility is so important. That came up with the mentee a lot. And then finally, which I think is a really good summary, is just working to create an ultimately inclusive culture. And I think that leads us to time for questions. Yes, Robyn.
We are, sorry, I just want to say we are actually at the end. Oh, my bad, Robyn. I cut you off.
Oh, I think I was actually going to say the same thing. Because there was a discrepancy, all the slides are done, but I understand that some of you might need to leave since there was a discrepancy in the time that was listed. So I'm going to post the post survey in the chat. If you could do that, if you do have to leave early, otherwise, if you can stay for another 10 minutes, it'd be great for questions. Thanks.
And I was just going to say, Alicia, if you want to say your question now, that would be a great time.
Sure, I've actually forgotten which one it was related to. But I think overall, what I'm curious about, and I kind of answered it myself, this is really with the idea of, in this environment at CU Boulder, this university, which I think when we implement good practices at the staff and then the student level, that our students take it out into the rest of the world. But how would this run up against some of the things like corporate law? You know, the making that flexibility, right, and change deadlines where we're able to, and still aligning that to protect somebody from a legal perspective. And that might be too complicated of a question. I'm just sharing out as somebody who's, been a supervisor and then have children on the other side of that, balancing those two can be difficult. And so maybe I'm just throwing it out there.
That's a great question. And really that calls back to way back in the beginning with ADA law. That does, ADA does impact the workplace, of course. The part where it's going to be the clincher is the definition of a reasonable accommodation.
Yeah.
If, your supervisor, your lawyer, if it comes to that, all agree that this constitutes a reasonable accommodation, then yes, but it really is dependent on the people in that case and the judge if it goes to court, let's say. But as long as you have a reasonable, you've got the here's what is reasonable, X, Y, Z, D, 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 that fits. If you have that somewhere, that's going to make sure that you're covered as much as possible. I would also really encourage you to reach out to our scholars over at the law school too, as I'm sure that they have some pretty hot takes about how ADA law has been successfully or unsuccessfully implemented, just to learn some more about case studies. But yeah, it's the gray area of reasonable accommodations.
Yeah, and what we're really trying to do here at the university is flex and kind of have to get away from reasonable, that language, right? But at the same time, still deliver for the students. Like I'm thinking as I manage projects, right? The longer I take, if I don't have a deadline, right? If we don't meet, that can mean horrible consequences financially for the university. If we simply don't comply with laws because we're flexing it. So there's that struggle, like at what point, you know, do we balance, you know, that's what I struggle with, just as somebody who's trying to work with people, not having to ask, not having to know, but just like, if you don't deliver, I'm left holding, what do I do? You know, like, how do you manage that?
And
or don't manage it. I don't know.
Yes, the flex area is another very curious aspect of reasonable accommodations, because in some circumstances, it doesn't really serve to not have a deadline. Some people, in fact, may actually need deadlines. So there are some that I would say that having that super flexibility of no deadlines at all, that's not going to be actually serving the students. But that truly does depend situation to situation. So yeah, man, I'd love to chat about that, to pick your brain about that more. What do my other teammates have to say on that front?
I guess I would just say a big part, we didn't touch on it like in these words, but individualization is like the biggest thing. That's why we we talked a lot about flexibility, but hopefully things would be extremely individualized, I guess. I don't know if that, like Charles said, it's so challenging to answer it all in such a brief space, but that's what I guess what I would add.
I like that because there's so much of this I haven't learned, like that whole idea of individualization. I need hours of this.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to those comments is just, it's not necessarily about like moving the deadline or removing the deadline. It's what are those supports along the way that we can help you get there in a way that feels sustainable. So instead of, you know, having those open conversations about where are you and how does burnout show up for you and things like that, and where do you thrive? If the bottom line is the work needs to be done on X date, that's the bottom line. But how can we have that open and candid conversation about like, what are the best ways that we can get you there in a way that doesn't sacrifice your well-being or put you in a position where you have to do extra labor to like advocate for yourself or get something done.
Yeah.
Team, we're having someone in the chat who'd like to do a comment, but they can't raise their hand, named Maggie Higgins.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, my name's Maggie. Hi, Alicia. I work in ADA compliance. So just wanted to mention that, and you kind of mentioned that like flexibility is great, but some people with disabilities really do benefit from rigidity and they want agendas in advance. And so it's so great for supervisors to be really supportive and offer lots of methods. And I would caution anyone from letting that take the place of the university assessing accommodations, right? We don't want individual supervisors doing that because that actually is what opens the university up to risk. So this was great. This was super informative, and I'm sorry, I just had to say it because we are here and that is our job. And there's a lot of little A accommodations that happen around campus where supervisors are just working with employees to be supportive as they should. But we're absolutely here to bridge that gap, and needing an accommodation is not a failure on anyone's part. We're here for a reason. So just want to put that plug out there that please contact us to talk about those things too.
Yes, we work hand in hand. Thank you for that, Maggie. That's really important to say out loud for sure.
Yeah, that really helped me a lot, Maggie. Thank you. I needed that balance.
I have to hop off the call in a moment. But I just want to say, as a person that lives at the intersection of a lot of the identities that you spotlighted here today, I really appreciate your advocacy. And I hear from you not a critique or a sort of lack of respect for the very important laws and structures that individuals with disabilities have advocated for to put in place. I don't hear that from you. What I hear is that you're advocating for a change in the spirit with which we approach these conversations. And I think that that's something in my experience that especially individuals working directly with individuals who struggle and in those positions that uphold some really harmful policies can learn a lot from. So again, I really appreciate your advocacy.
Thanks, Tasha. That is a really great summation of what we're getting at here today.
Thanks to everybody who's piecing out here. Great to have you, and thanks for coming along with us on this journey. I did see Jennifer ask a question about if there's a training offered to supervisors. None of us are supervisors, unfortunately, so we don't. I for one don't know about that. I wonder if Maggie, since she's here, Maggie, do you happen to know anything about that within compliance?
I think she might have hopped off because I saw her say thank you.
Ah, drat.
That's okay. I have
What a
some
resource.
I have some a link I can share. There are quite a few, I think, that are tangential, relevant, right? Not exactly like the exact sentiment that we're getting at, but some that come to my mind are under our diversity, learning and development through HR. We have implicit bias, allyship, becoming an inclusive leader. Pretty much that whole list is good. There's also another one called Simplify Language, which can really help with like thinking about the way you communicate in the words that you use and how that can show up for other people. So that's another one I would recommend if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Go ahead, Robyn. What's up?
Tab, I am a supervisor, and I would recommend all of those. And I would recommend that if you actually, I mean, obviously it's always a comfort level. I actively seek people. We do a weekly meeting with our entire staff, and I always ask them if there's a training I should be taking. So I think it's also, if you know something you think would be really helpful for your supervisor to have, it's possible they're open to it. I'll take any class that my staff tells me they think would help me do my job better, including understanding them. And I'm always going to put out there that the mental health first aid 8-hour intensive is a very hard class to sit through, but amazing, has made me a lot better at understanding what I don't understand about my job with these issues. So I would recommend that to anyone.
I think a lot of these things we have, you know, concepts in our brain of like how we want to show up, but until we're in that space and have to come up with the language and come up with the words and have that dialogue, you know, you don't know exactly how you're going to show up. And so those trainings can definitely help with that practice piece. The session was mental health first aid. And we'll put, yeah, it's in the chat now. They offer it at a campus level, but you can also request it for your unit. We've done that in the AAC where it was just advisors. And so it was really cool. We could talk about that training in our context and how it shows up for us in our roles.
And I just want to thank y'all for doing a wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for all of your help today. And this has been recorded. So as soon as we take off that full hour of space of me accidentally signing on earlier, we will see about getting this sent to people. But thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you to our presenters. And thank you to Patricia for hopping on so they can mute people so I could do the land acknowledgement. I really appreciate that. And if you need anything at all, please reach out to the organizers. The Colorado Disability Symposium is organized by staff as volunteer work. So this is something we're all passionate about and think it's important and always want to learn how to do better, even if it's just getting the schedule right, which sometimes it's half the battle. Thank you. And Charles, I'll see you tomorrow. Be well, everyone.
See you tomorrow. Bye.